Okay. So I'm here with Steve Hammond. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. Steve is former Deputy Associate Director at the U.S. Geological Survey. Currently, he is the Syphax family historian and genealogist at Syphax Genealogy, and also docent, right, at the Arlington House.
Correct. That's correct.
And Steve and I met virtually because right now he's part of a movement to get the full history to be known in the United States of the Arlington House. And you can say much more than I just said, which is probably even wrong, Steve.
Well,
Um,
yeah, thank you very much, Amanda. Do you want me to just describe what we've been
yeah, so
working on?
what is that movement? What's going on?
So I don't know that I would qualify it as a movement as much as an opportunity for descendants of this space to help the Park Service do a better job of sharing our national history at this space. This space is a pretty special space in a lot of different ways. The location of which is, I think, an important aspect of it. It currently sits in a 17-acre space inside of the boundaries of Arlington National Cemetery, right across the river, Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Many of your viewers or listeners have probably been to Arlington National Cemetery for one reason or another, but most people don't know when they enter that space that space before it was a cemetery was a plantation. It actually was an 1,100-acre plantation that was owned by the grandson of Martha Washington. And the owner was George Washington Parke Custis. He was, as I said, the grandson of Martha Washington and her first husband. Another fast fact is most people don't know that Martha Washington was married twice. She and George Washington didn't have children, but with her first husband, they had 2 children, and her son had 4 children, and George and Martha Washington raised the 2 younger children. Uh, Ultimately, when Martha passed away, this property was inherited. He inherited property and he inherited people, and he began to build a plantation house. And my particular family is connected directly to George Washington Parke Custis because he had a daughter with an enslaved woman prior to having a daughter with his wife. This
Okay, so
daughter
he
married
had okay, the son of Martha Washington,
Grants. Yeah, go
the
ahead. Go ahead.
grandson, had a baby with an enslaved woman prior to getting married. Got it.
That is correct.
Okay.
So Martha Washington died in 1799. Excuse me, George Washington died in 1799, and Martha died in 1802.
Okay.
And so in 1803, her grandson inherits this property, and about the same time, 1803, he has a daughter with an enslaved woman. At the same time, he is moving to this new property to establish a plantation of his own. And he wanted to build a house that was a memorial to his step-grandfather, George Washington. And so he, as you mentioned, he had a daughter with an enslaved woman, and then 7 years later, excuse me, 4 years later, in 1807, he had a daughter with his white wife. Now, here's where it gets really cool and complicated. It continues to get complicated. The first daughter is
Okay.
enslaved, and she's helping to raise her half sister, but right.
Right.
She is allowed, when she turns 18, she's allowed to marry the butler of the dining room. His name was Charles Syphax. I am a
Wow.
relative to Charles Syphax. Charles's sister, Nancy Syphax, is my third great grandmother. So that's how I'm connected to this picture. So Charles marries Mariah in the dining room of the house, something that's unheard of generally, is to have the
Interesting.
owner, the enslaver, allow his enslaved property marry in the house. So that's one big thing that happens.
That's huge.
This is 1821. 10 years later, in 1831,
Hmm.
George Washington Parke's white daughter marries Robert E. Lee in the same space. So, as you might be able to tell here, we are connected to Martha Washington, or this branch is connected to Martha Washington through DNA, but we're also connected to the Lee family through marriage. And so and that's just one family here.
That's just one family, but what that's history. I mean, this is our
It's part of
first
history.
family.
That part of the story does not get told as well as it should by the National Park Service in this space. This space is currently called Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial.
I see.
Robert E. Lee never owned this space, but he married into the family. He took on a leadership role of helping to manage the resources and be an enslaver and manage people in that space. And as a result of going to fight for the South and then coming back into the Union after the war, he made statements that said it's time to put down our arms and become, one country again. And this is one of the reasons why he was recognized as someone who a memorial should be placed to. So in my mind, Robert E. Lee, he has a place in this space.
Hmm.
If I was writing a book about this, a 30-page book, Robert E. Lee would have like 2 chapters. I mean, it's an important piece,
Yes.
but he's part of the story, but he's not the story. This
Right.
he it so we're working as descendants to kind of answer your question about the
Yeah.
what our activity is here, is that we want to do a better job of sharing the entire narrative of this space, which includes Robert E. Lee. He needs to be a part of this conversation, but includes many, many other people. And so our goal is to ask Congress, who named this space after Robert E. Lee, made it a memorial. We are asking Congress to redesignate this space as Arlington House National Historic Site. The idea being that it would be more inclusive and less exclusive of the stories that are told today.
Steve, that is really powerful on so many levels, and it just seems commonsensical in all honesty, actually.
As a docent in that space, I'm there several times a month to talk to the public, to talk about the history, and I tell them that I'm a descendant of the family. And there's always questions. There are pictures of me there, and they say, "Is that you?" Or did you see me in that picture in the hallway? And they'll say, "That wasn't you." And I use that as a way to tell stories, to help people see that this place is bigger than just the one person that's there. And I think that that's really important. And as we talk about some of these things, most people say, this is a no-brainer. This is
Yeah.
something that is really actually pretty easy to do, and something that we could agree that we need to tell the whole story.
Just right, exactly. You're not talking about leaving Robert E. Lee's piece out. You're talking about including the so many other pieces. Steve,
Right.
can I ask, um, going back, did you always know that you were a descendant of this family? Did you grow up knowing this?
I did not. I first began to learn about my family history when I was in 8th grade, about the age that many 8th graders come to visit Washington, D.C. and have a chance to visit this house, which is kind of ironic.
It is.
So in middle school, one of my mom's first cousins, so it would be a cousin to me, but a generation behind her, began to tell me about my family history. Our families attended church together. we, regularly, went to her house for lunch and we would talk, and she began to, one of the first questions that she asked me was, did you know that you are connected to the first family of the United States? And as a Black kid from Denver, Colorado,
Wow.
who's been told that he's connected to the first family of the United States, I said, get out of here. What are the chances? There's no way. But you know what? That 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 question got me onto this journey that I've been on for more than 50 years now, of asking, first of saying, is this really true? So trying to determine what the facts, the fiction, and the folklore are for all of these things. And what usually happens with all of this is that they are interwoven. There are
Yeah.
things that are fact, there are things that are, fiction,
Yeah.
and then there are aspects that are folklore that as stories get passed down, they end up kind of changing a little bit. But it's the people who are telling this, it's their personal truth. And I want to respect those personal truths as we do this. So my work as, this being a hobby and now more of a job for me, is to better understand and pick apart and put back together again these histories, the folklore, the fact, and the fiction that bring all of these things together. So
It's funny
50 plus
because,
years.
yeah, when I got on ancestry.com, I realized that a lot of what I thought was folklore was real. It's interesting and maybe even a little bit surprising that so much of the oral stories passed down are accurate. There's just I find that kind of
Right.
interesting. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, what happens a lot of times is that as we think about genealogy and genealogists and how things are documented, people focus solely on primary sources, birth certificates and the
yes,
census and things that they can put their hands on. And they give less credence to the folklore, to the oral histories, which is something that I think is critical in terms of bringing some of these pieces together. In fact, one of the things that we're doing at the Arlington House right now is we have a project underway that's called an ethnohistory. And the ethnohistory is intended to do a deep dive to try to fill in some of the gaps that exist in this space. So we want to understand the history of the land. We want to understand the history of the people. We want to understand the history of, what's going around in society that affects all these things. And we do that by looking at the primary sources. We look at, we're doing oral histories and interviews, and all of that is being packaged together to try to give us a better sense of what's going on. And what we found out is that this is a fabric, it's a quilt of a variety of things, and it obviously extends way beyond Arlington House. I mean,
yeah.
it goes back to Mount Vernon, and it goes on beyond Mount Vernon. And so we are hoping that we can use all of this information as a way, one, to help our country better understand this part of our history, the complexities, two, to help us have better and easier conversations about this space, to help us repair, damaged relationships, and to try to heal from some of the challenges that have existed as a result of enslavement and slavery in our country. And we're hoping that changes like redesignation to this house are one step that create the space for all of this to begin to unfold. And you can't beat the view from that space. So, if you can get people there to see that and then start to have conversations, it's a really powerful experience, in my opinion.
Have you seen that 10 million names? There's a 10 million names, and it's really fascinating. It's a project, I guess. I've only seen a little bit, but they have in uh some of like enslaved people post slavery. They have them speaking on tape. on audio. And one woman spoke and she was like 114, and it was 1974. And there was something about that, to know that this is a woman who was enslaved and she was speaking in 1974, that made me understand, and I think everybody can understand, this is not something that is thousands and thousands of years ago. This is us. It is our story. It was our story, and it kind of continues to be our story because of the way time moves. And
Absolutely.
I,
Absolutely. Despite the fact that this is 1, 2, 3 generations away, it is still very much a fabric of our country. And I think that that is highlighted by the fact that we are still struggling. We're still raw as a result of all the things that
yes,
have happened here. You know,
absolutely.
time tends to heal, but time also allows you to forget. And a lot of times forgetting means, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And in my
Right. And
opinion,
yeah,
we need to do a better job of accepting those things and being able to talk about how they have brought us to where we are and what can we do with that to make a better society, a better country, a better world.
you know what you're making me think, Steve? When you get a vaccination, sometimes if you don't move your arm around and really do stuff,
Get
it gets
sore?
a lump. Yeah, and it gets almost like this hard, immovable lump, and then it becomes harder. And
Mm,
so I think that by you creating, you're creating a space where you're saying, hey, let's just explore this facet and part of our history. It's moving the arm. It's kind of just opening it so that there isn't that solid,
that's a good analogy.
immovable. Can I ask, by the way, what did you do as deputy associate director of the US? What does
Yeah.
that mean?
So I actually worked for the United States Geological Survey for 40 years, about 40 years, just short of 40 years. And I was an earth scientist. My background is mathematics and geology, and I was able to apply that immediately after graduation from college. I did a variety of things working for the Geological Survey during my career. I spent the early part of my career as a hydrologist, understanding our nation's rivers and the impact of runoff and flooding in different places. I spent a number of years working on the slopes of Mount St. Helens volcano in southwestern Washington, in which I was working to understand and document the hazards associated with volcanoes. Many people think about volcanoes only being the material that is, extruded in the air or lava that is on the ground, but it also creates mud flows and melts glaciers and causes a lot of other environmental hazards that people don't necessarily understand or are aware of. So I spent a lot of time understanding how the sediment clogs our rivers and changes how we can navigate and use those rivers. And as my career moved on, I became more involved with emergency response. And so as deputy associate director of natural hazards, I had a responsibility to help our organization mobilize to respond to earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes and a variety of environmental hazards that impact our nation's interior, the ground and the people that are around there.
Oh,
And part of our role was to help educate the public so that they understand when they were moving into places or living in
mm,
places that there were hazards. If you live next to a river, you need to be prepared to deal with flooding. If you're living next to a volcano, you need to be prepared to
oh my
deal with those
gosh.
issues too. So I love that work. And although I worked there for 40 years, the pull for understanding my family history while I was young enough to do that prompted me to retire a few years ago.
That is fascinating. The through line is almost that compulsion to also educate and inform the public to take what you know and share it. Because when we were talking just at the beginning of the conversation, I thought, oh, this is a guy who probably as a kid was obsessed with history and went into the field of history.
Yeah,
And, but it's so fascinating to find that math, science,
yeah.
so what,
I
what do you
guess
want
I
to,
guess the crossover there for me is
yeah.
that I like to think of myself as a detective.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
so the research that I was doing on our nation's landscape was working to have a better understanding of processes. So I'm a detective trying to understand how our Earth works and trying to help describe that to the public and use it in ways to help make the public safer. And when I think of my work as a genealogist and a family historian, I'm also a detective. I can't
Yeah.
tell you how exciting it is for me to turn over that rock using
Hmm.
my
Yeah, right.
genealogy uh, vernacular, to turn over a rock and discover a new piece of information about a family member, or where we were, or something that draws things together. To me, that is exhilarating, and I find it really rewarding to be able to turn around and then use that, one, to share it with family, because that was one of the other things that my cousin taught me,
Mm,
is that I had a responsibility to share this information with others.
yeah.
Don't keep it to yourself. You got to share it. And then be able to teach and use it in a way that inspires people to think about and ask questions about themselves. Man, maybe I've got some stuff that I should learn about my family. So
Yeah.
I see myself as a detective.
Steve, that makes me think, when you talk about sharing that and when you talk about learning this as an eighth grader, it's a complicated thing to learn
Yes, you
because
bet.
you're learning, wow, I'm connected in a way to our first president. That's like exciting. I'd be shouting it from the rooftops. And then also, I'm connected to somebody who was enslaved. I'm connected in this way. You know, did you think about that as you were growing up? How did that sit in your brain?
As an eighth grader, it took a while for me to process that.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't shout it from the rooftops of, hey, guess what I learned? I've had friends that have talked about, going into the classroom and them, being told that, through their mother or father, hey, I'm a descendant of so and so, and everybody kind of poo-poos that, or,
Yeah.
kind of disregards that. That didn't
Yeah.
happen for me. For me, it was more of an introspection of, how can this be?
Yes.
George Washington didn't have any, African American kids. I mean, I'm thinking, this is an eighth grader. I'm thinking about colonial, United States, and how these pieces fit and how African Americans fit into that. And I said, there's just
Yeah.
no way that I fit into that picture. But it lit this fire in me to understand. And so one of the biggest shifts for me is when I had the opportunity to start to look at George Washington. The first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to find his family tree. Who were his kids, and then I find out, the first thing that I find out is he and Martha didn't have any kids. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's like, boom,
Right.
when you're connected to the first president and all of a sudden you find out he doesn't have any kids, that says, okay, so now we've got a whole
Right.
nother set of questions
Now
that
the
we need to
detective
start
has
to,
to really get to work.
and it just kind of unfolds from there, and you start to understand what family conditions are, what family situations
Yeah.
are, and you begin to put pieces together, and then you start thinking wider, more broadly, and you start to see that this is really a mosaic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That the question, or not the question, but there are so many people right now who want to know our history and want to know the full breadth and depth of our history and want to know, like, what makes us human and what is my background, good, bad, who am I? And then there is a strong contingent that says, no, we don't want to know the history. It's done. Move on. Don't worry about it. Start here.
Yeah.
Why is knowing our history and all of the complicated facets of our history, why do you think that's important?
That's a great question. For me, as I think about that question, I think about the fact that if we understand where we've been and what our history is, we have a better insight, more insight of where we want to go and where we don't want to go for that matter. And so for me, understanding more about our history helps, kind of guide me in my life in terms of how
Mhm.
can I help make this a better place. And I think if we deny that these things take place, we have the high probability that we will repeat some of the really not so nice kinds of things that we do to each other in this society. I think we need to learn from those things and set goals to do better.
Powerful. And now, Steve, I'm just going to ask you random questions that have nothing to do
Uh-oh.
with, right. Now is
You're
the
going to
time
the
to,
other side of my brain now. I'm
that's
just
right.
telling you.
Switch hats. Now is the time to really be brave. Best song ever. What pops into your mind?
Best song ever. I'm I like jazz music, so I will say Compared to What by Les McCann.
Oh, okay. When you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up? Little boy, even before eighth
I
grade.
wanted to be an astronaut. I was sure I was going to be an
Oh,
astronaut. My
that
wife
makes
today says that if she could put me on a rocket to Mars, she'd do it tomorrow. I don't know if that's a good thing
I
or a
don't
bad.
know. I don't know.
I would be loving it. I just want you to know I would be loving it.
Wow. Okay. Some good advice you've received or good advice that you would be interested in sharing.
I think the advice that I've received is know who your people are.
Mm,
Be in touch with them.
yeah.
Let them know how you're connected. Let them know that you love them.
Who do you admire? Who is somebody who, when you think of like, that's my North Star, that's somebody I really admire, and why?
Hmm. There are many people that fit into that. One would be the person who got me interested in geology, a professor at my college. But someone who is made a big difference in my life in terms of trying to help others is Dr. Isaac J. Crumley. He's a vice president and the founder of the Cooperative Developmental Energy Program at Fort Valley State University. And he has put together a program that's helped minorities and women find their way into professional um, roles in the energy industry. And for me, it's been about, as I've been working with the Geological Survey, and there are so few, or had been so few, faces of color and women in that organization. One of my goals coming into the organization was how can I change this organization so that it's more reflective of our society? And he has been a North Star for me to help me
Oh,
think about how I can accomplish that.
that's beautiful. This is a tricky one. What do people get wrong about you?
Mm. Probably that I'm too serious. I like to think I'm a pretty fun guy. I tend to joke a lot, but a lot of times people tend to think I'm maybe a little too serious.
Interesting. Maybe it's, have you always been scholastic?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It's that learned quality, Steve.
but I have fun.
That's awesome. And then finally, if your life were a book, what do you think either the theme of the book would be or the message that the book contained? What do you think?
The message would be one, it would be uplifting. It would be one to set goals and work towards them. Uh, Life is not a straight line. Life is circuitous. Be prepared to take lots of journeys and zigzags as you set goals. I think it's important to set goals, but I think it's important to recognize that while you're setting those goals, you may have to stray off of that path in order to get there. So the key is trying to create space and direction that allow you to be yourself, have fun while you're getting there on the journey, but also have a goal that you're working towards.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, you could retire and just, you know, hang out.
Be with my
Go look at,
grandkids.
that's right, be with your beautiful grandkids. And I know you're still doing that. And but what a legacy that you're giving them. What a lesson that you're giving them.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Appreciate the opportunity, and I hope this helps someone somewhere.